Today we're going to talk a little bit about the Native Americans who existed in Central, North, and South America when Columbus arrived here. And we're going to look at that period of history all the way up to when the first successful English settlements arrived on the eastern coast of the United States. It really is about a 115-year period of history. So we're going to put a lot into this one presentation as far as history, but there was a number of things that happened there. Let me warn you before we get much further here, this will probably go against everything you've previously learned about Native Americans in your history classes up until this time. Before we talk about that though, I want to put this question here. Does history itself ever change? The short answer is yes, but many people do make the mistake of thinking that history is static, that it doesn't change. If history was static, there really would be no reason for us to re-examine what we already think we know, but we do need to re-examine that. We're constantly discovering new things that help us tell a more complete history of what happened. An example of this, historians will work with geologists, archaeologists, anthropologists, even scientists in labs to get a more complete, accurate telling of the past. And a fantastic example of this is historians working with all these people to really give us a more complete telling of the Native American story from Columbus to the start of the English colonies. Now, before we get into the specifics, there were, even here, this is about the time that the English begin to settle the eastern coast of the U.S., and you can see these are the major Indian groups in the 1600s. So even after, you're going to learn here, even at this time, there weren't nearly as many Indians, maybe close to 95% of the population had been wiped out, but even with that's the case, you can still see there's major Indian groups in the early 1600s in the U.S. There's three common myths surrounding the Native Americans. The first one, Indians had little impact on their physical surroundings. Number two, small number of Indians actually lived here. And number three, Europeans beat the Indians because Europeans had horses, they had steel, and they had guns as well too. I want to talk about these myths one at a time. The first myth is that Indians had little impact on the physical surroundings. That's absolutely not the case whatsoever. 2/3 of the land in present-day United States were farmed. They were terraced. They had irrigation systems that were built into these settlements. Large mounds even exist today that show, they mark these Indian settlements. Indians also used fire to manage the forest. They would routinely use this fire to burn the underbrush that grew around the trees, resulting that many of the first settlers that came here recognized that forests didn't have many plants under the canopy of the trees. 30 years after Columbus's first trip and 80 years even before Jamestown, the first successful English colony, European explorers sailing north of the Carolinas reported that the coastline was, quote, densely populated, and it was smoky with Indian bonfires, and they could smell the burning hundreds of miles away before they even got to the fires. So much for the idea of this untouched virgin native land. So myth number one is out. Myth number two, fewer Indians than Europeans lived here. Before 1500, the American continents had a population of, 90 to 100 million people who lived North, Central, and South America. Now, if you take it at those high numbers, what that would mean is at the time Europe only had 70 million people living there. Pre-Columbus population could possibly have been over 120 million people. Here's a map that shows these. These numbers have been around for quite some time, even as early as the 1930s and the high range up into the 1966. These numbers, most historians today are estimating that these numbers are that they are going with the high end of these estimates, saying that's probably more than likely the number of Indians that lived here. The question is, where did all these people go? Because by the time the English settlers got here in the early 1600s, it really wasn't that heavily populated. So where did they all go? And talk about this here. It really comes from number one here. It says disease, disease, disease. This is a third myth. European superior technology caused the Indian defeat. Really what it was it came down to disease. Diseases like smallpox, influenza, which is a flu, and measles, they were mistakenly spread, at least initially, by Spanish conquistadors and English fishermen who went along the eastern coastline of present-day United States. The natives had no natural immunity, and as many as 95% of the population died from this. Massive, massive death. We have nothing in European history that even begins to compare to that kind of death. To give you an idea, as a result, at that time, it's estimated that 1/5 of the total world population died because of these plagues here in the New World. So it's much, much bigger than even the Black Death that occurred in medieval Europe had on the European people. How did it work out that the Europeans were immune? They could transfer these diseases, but they didn't seem to get as sick from them like the Native Americans. They sure didn't get wiped out 95%. So what was it? For thousands of years, Eurasians lived closely to domesticated animals. Now these are like horses, cows, sheep, goats, etc. Animals that have been tamed so you can keep them in an enclosed area. The Europeans were eating, drinking, they were breathing in the germs that these animals carried. Now, every once in a while, yes, epidemics would happen, breakouts of these diseases would happen, but those who survived, the Europeans that survived, they ended up acquiring antibodies that they then passed on to the next generation, and eventually over generations, Europeans gained an increased immunity to these types of diseases. Now, Native Americans, they had no prior exposure to these diseases that were transferred from animals to humans, because the only large domesticated animal that they had was a llama, but it was only found in parts of South America. It wasn't kept indoors, it wasn't milked, and they only occasionally ate the llama for food. So you don't have that transfer of milk or of disease going like you had happening in Europe. Germs and diseases ultimately become the most deadly agent of conquest. They absolutely do. Without those, it would have been very difficult for the Europeans to get a stronghold in the New World. What was left behind after these diseases was a scene similar to Will Smith. If you've seen the movie I Am Legend, this is him walking alone in the movie I Am Legend. In this movie, there was a new disease where very few people had genetic protection from getting it. It quickly spread out through the population, at least through New York City, and just wiped it out. There was only just a handful of survivors, even in the whole region. If his history was passed on in the oral tradition, Will Smith's here, say like there was no books, and nearly all the people who were historians and storytellers, if they died, their history, Will Smith's history and his traditions would die along with them too. And then if we came to New York sometime later, the only way we'd understand about Will Smith and his society was to see what they left behind. It would be very difficult for us to have a complete understanding. And this really is where we are today in our understanding of most Native American groups prior to Columbus and the English colonists. The fact was there were so few people left. Civilizations and groups of people were just decimated. So it's really hard for us to completely understand.